Oh,
Like,
beautiful thing behind you.
uh,
Uh,
yeah, it's called a Huanglong. Uh, it's in Sichuan province. So
oh,
it's a very scenery area with all kinds of these kind of very colorful
mm,
pond, but it's kind of a layer. So this is the top layer, and then you go to the
mm,
next level.
mm,
There's some waterfall, and then similar things, and then you go to another
mm,
layer. So
mm.
it's just a huge area, very scenic, very beautiful, and
Wow. I would love to go. I've told you many times that I love Chinese painting. And
mhm,
I have to say, seeing the sort of landscapes that you put behind you, I understand where the inspiration for many of these paintings has
mhm.
come from. Anyway, there we go.
Yeah, and then I think you would like another place, Huangshan, the Yellow Mountains, even better.
I've heard about
Yeah,
this. Absolutely. Apparently it's
yeah.
incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very much like the painting. When you're walking in there, you feel like you're
Mm.
walking in the Chinese painting.
Oh wow. Okay. Gosh.
Okay. Another packed week.
To put it mildly.
Okay, I want to start with you asking a question that I wanted to ask you last time, actually. So the US sent a economic delegation, a high level, to China. It has
Mm.
some high level officials from the Treasury, from the Fed, and from the Securities and Exchange Commission. What do you make of that? Because now here's what the Mr. Neiman said. Neiman is the assistant to treasurer. So what he said was this: the purpose of the trip is to improve, among other things. He said a whole lot of things. Among other things, to improve communication in the
Mm.
event of a financial stress. Now, when he used the word stress, I feel like are they expecting some kind of a crisis or something? What do you make of that?
Well, absolutely, that must be what they're afraid of. Because why else would he be talking about it? One of the most interesting. It's interesting you started with this very topic because I was thinking the same thing because we have this very strong delegation being sent to China, talking about financial stress. You find references to it in the Chinese media, obviously, and in squirreled away in the financial pages of some bigger media outlets. But there has been a huge effort overall to talk about this as little as possible. So my sense is they're very worried about the overall financial situation, particularly ahead of the election. And they want to talk about communications because, in the event that there is some major event over the next few weeks or months, they hope that they can talk to the Chinese and that the Chinese, with their enormous reserves, will come to the rescue. That, I think, is what this is all about ultimately. What else can it be?
Yeah, because they established last year, they established some kind of financial working group. They call it a
Yeah,
financial working group. Now,
mm,
I think it's a good thing, that they established
yeah.
this working group and they visit, etc. But any time when the United States does something good, I got a little bit suspicious.
Yeah.
I- Isn't the church said that the Americans will always do the right thing after they tried everything else? Isn't that
That's
what church said?
that is absolutely true. That's completely true. He did say that. And by the way, remember his mother was American, so he knew them very well. But I think the real problem with the US always is that it wants to have its cake and eat it as well, as we say in
Mhm,
Britain.
mhm,
On the one hand, they're clearly worried about the situation in the financial markets. And
mhm,
I think what they're worried about most, actually, at this moment in time, is a run on the dollar, and which would put upward pressure on prices in the United States and might cause some problems for US financial institutions. So I think that's probably what they're worried about. And I understand that the latest Treasury bond auctions have not gone especially well. The US can still find buyers, but the major international buyers, of which, of course,
mhm,
China historically was one, are not only staying away, they're actually trying to unload their treasury bonds. So I think what the US wants is that they're worried that things could
mhm,
start to happen, that there might be pressure on the dollar. that the Federal Reserve might be forced to reverse its interest rate policy. The moment it wants to bring interest rates down, it might be forced to raise them again if there's problems with the dollar. And they're also worried that if something like that happens, there may be real problems on the bond market, which is logically there ought to be, given the rate at which debt levels in the United States are escalating. Now, all of this is well and good. And the United States is absolutely right to say there's a major financial crisis in America. The American economy is still big, so big that it will affect everybody. And China really perhaps ought to step in or try to step in to prevent the damage spreading.
Yeah.
But the United States wants the help, but it's not prepared to do anything in response. Putting aside all the many geopolitical things we've been talking about, Taiwan, South China Sea, Philippines, the latest announcement that the United States' nuclear weapons policy is now focused on China. Put all that aside, even in terms of economic policy, they will take the help, but they won't do anything to correct their own systemic problems. I mean, what they will want is, the Chinese to come along and buy, $500 billion of treasury bonds or something like that to stabilize the market. And then once the market is stabilized, they'll go back to doing exactly what they've been doing. They're not going to change anything. And they don't seem to be structurally capable of doing that. And I think that's the fundamental problem. So it's not just a case of the Americans exhausting every single possibility until they finally arrive at the right one. It's just that I think this time the United States will never arrive at the right outcome because it is incapable now of doing so.
Yeah, it's just so amazing to me that on the one hand, the US does seems need help from China, but it's so reluctant to do anything, from their end, either to do something domestically or to improve the relationship with China, right? There's a lot of things they can improve to China. If you need China's help, why, tariffs and sanctions and this and that, endless, right? You need China's help. Why don't you, show some courtesy, some friendship, some serious effort to improve it? But they don't, right?
Or even act in your own long-term best interests, which should tell you that ultimately confrontation with the other great economic superpower, which is now the world's biggest manufacturing power, is not in the long-term interests of the United States. One of the reasons why America's economic problems are becoming so acute is precisely because instead of working with China in the mutual interest of both countries, doing what the Chinese like to call a win-win policy, they're doing the opposite, which is only making their own problems greater. Now, it's not helping China. I mean, I think this is the other thing to say. I mean, China would undoubtedly benefit from a mutually beneficial, intelligent policy in the United States. The Chinese are, rubbing their hands with glee and saying, we're looking forward to the day when everything in the United States collapses. That's not, I think, what the Chinese are thinking at all. Quite the opposite. But you can only help someone if they're prepared to help themselves. And the US is not prepared to help themselves. There was an extraordinary article, very brilliant article by a brilliant but very, very flawed economic commentator who doesn't, by the way, like China at all, in the British media, Ambrose Evans Pritchard. And he said that America is behaving like a drunkard. It's absolutely drunk on debt, and it can't kick the habit. And that's the trouble.
Yeah, yeah. But when there is a crisis in the American, I think there's almost like consensus now that a crisis is looming, considering the debt, and there is a real estate, commercial real estate market crisis actually is ongoing right now.
Yeah.
And then also some banking problems, in particular, like a mid-size, small-size bank problems, etc., related to the real estate, the commercial real estate. Now, all these will come at one point. It will come, right? So
Yeah.
it seems that everybody's, but when that happens, we are all going to be affected, right? It's not
Yes.
just the United States. Everyone will be affected, right?
Absolutely. Can I just say, China is already affected. When you were there, you talked to me about how, land prices, commercial real estate prices are not just, also residential real estate prices have been rising in China. And this is putting housing out of reach for many Chinese people. And this is causing many issues and concern in China. Everything is connected. And this is an absolute truism, which is also true. One of the reasons why land prices in so many places are so high, and the Chinese government, by the way, does not want high land prices.
No.
It's been always trying to to push them down. That's why it encourages construction. But the reason it's happening is because when prices of real estate and commercial properties in the United States and in its economic satellites like Britain are so high, it puts upward pressure on real estate prices everywhere. Because countries that trade with the United States inevitably are infected by what goes on there.
Yeah, for example, a small country like Sweden, the price now is very high. I met a friend in China when I was there. She is from, she otherwise lives in Sweden. And she was telling me that the prices, even when I left, that was like 20 years ago or something, it was already high, but she said it's way higher than when you were there. It just extremely, it's like out of reach for a lot of people now, which is pretty stunning to me. But
the same is true exactly in Germany, by the way. Now, Germany famously avoided this. In fact, the policy of the Bundesbank, the German central bank, was to prevent real estate bubbles and to try to get the cost of real estate, keep it low, because they didn't want investment to go into the real estate markets. They wanted investment to go into manufacturing. And, this is very much the policy. They talked about, concrete gold being ultimately a form of inflation. And as we all know, the German central bank hates inflation, but they've completely lost control of it now. If you go to Germany today, you see that property prices now are higher than they have ever been at any time that I can remember, and are surging.
Yeah, I noticed that. I noticed whenever the U.S. Real estate is price, is high, everywhere else, it's high. Yes, absolutely. Okay, let's talk about the Prime Minister's visit. The Chinese Prime Minister is now visiting Russia. The Chinese media actually said a few days ago they were rumored that Xi Jinping will be visiting Russia, but turns out it's the Prime Minister. What do you make of it? Now, I think the Xinhua, what Xinhua says is this: the news agency said the discussion will focusing on bilateral relations, practical cooperation in various fields such as trade, economy, energy, and emerging sectors like technological innovation and cross-border e-commerce. It doesn't say anything about Kursk. I'm sure they will talk about Kursk invasion, don't you think?
Well, of course they will. They will talk about the whole range of relations. They will talk about Kursk. They will talk about the war in Ukraine. They will talk about relations with the United States. I should say a few things. Firstly, this trip has received an enormous amount of publicity in Russia. The Russians have been preparing for it. I've no doubt that it was Li Qiang. Am I get pronouncing his right? That they were expecting, not Xi Jinping, by the way. He's meeting with, he's met, I believe, in fact, with Mishustin, the Russian Prime Minister. He's going to meet with Putin himself. He's staying in Moscow for 3 days. So this is a big meeting. And then he's moving on to Minsk, to Belarus, which Belarus is now, in effect, an outlying part of the Russian economic world, because those two economies have become so completely integrated. And the Russian take on this is that this is all preparing the ground for the meeting, I believe it's in Kazan, of the BRICS states, that the Russians and the Chinese are working on the agenda for that meeting, and which is going to be primarily an economic and trade and finance agenda, that this is the major
Okay.
focus,
Mhm.
and that they're ironing out all of that. Remember, the Russians are the hosts of this meeting, and will be preparing the agenda, and they want to make sure that every part of it is sorted out with the Chinese in advance. I'm going to say something, and this is something else. Now, the Russians themselves don't quite like to put it in quite this way, because they're a proud, touchy people and all of that. But when you drill down and read all the things that are being discussed, it's absolutely clear to me that, as far as the Russians are concerned, they have made a political, economic, strategic decision, which is that the way forward for Russia economically, not just in the short term, but over the medium long term, is as part of a Eurasian system with China at its core. So the Russian economy is going to be industrially and economically reorganized in a way that connects it to China, not greater China, which is what people in the West like to say, but one where the relationship is going to become economically very connected and very integrated, so that the Russians will be providing all kinds of things for China. China will be doing the same. There'll be similar standards, all kinds of things of this kind, and this is momentous.
Yeah.
It is enormously consequential.
Mhm.
I was looking at what's happening, for example, in the Russian car industry. Russia, by the way, has the biggest motor vehicle market in Europe, I believe, even higher than Germany's now. Russians buy lots and lots of cars, and they're starting to make cars. I mean, the motor vehicle market was pushed very hard down as a result of the sanctions in 2022. It's now surging upwards, and what it's becoming very closely interconnected with the Chinese car market. So you're starting to see Chinese cars being made in Russian factories, Russian inputs now starting to be made for Chinese factories in China, work on sorting out lithium. Russia believes it has, in fact, undoubtedly it does have very, very large lithium deposits, lots of things of this kind. So I think this is the fact. The Russians have just made this decision that, they used to try to maintain a kind of equidistance between the West and China, that this has failed, that the best thing to do is to just accept the fact that the relationships, the trade relationship with China, that is the most important one. And this is what they want to develop with Li Qiang in this visit that he's undertaking in Russia now.
But what about Kursk? Because this
Yeah.
is got a lot of attention because this is the high level visit from China after what
Yes.
happened in Kursk invasion.
Yes.
So what do you think they talk about that?
Right. This is that. Now, this is where we come to another topic.
Yeah.
And here again, the Russians have been actually talking quite a lot. And what they're saying is that the result of the Kursk operation is that it's killed any idea of negotiations in the short or even medium term between Russia and Ukraine. And the Russians really didn't feel that this was the right time for negotiations. One of very senior Russian official, Dmitry Medvedev, very strong hawk, by the way, but he's actually said negotiations now would be premature, that any negotiations that we were pushed into by our friends, it was very interesting words that he was saying, that this has educated our friends. He didn't mention China.
Mhm.
And I don't think it was only China that he was talking about, by the way. He probably meant Brazil, India, all sorts of other countries. Any negotiations that we were sort of drawn into at this time would have ended up being used by the Ukrainians to string us along in exactly the way that they have been doing for a long time. And we would have been put under pressure to make concessions, which the Ukrainians would never have reciprocated on. So this isn't the right time for negotiations. And it enables us, this event in Kursk, because we were under a lot of pressure over the last couple of weeks to agree to negotiations with the Ukrainians, that this has taken the pressure off us. And we can explain that now to our friends in China, our friends in India, our friends in Brazil, that negotiating with the Ukrainians is impossible. They talk one moment about negotiating, the next moment they actually invade our own territory and try to seize our nuclear power stations. So it is dangerous trying to do this at this time. And I think that is what they're going to be explaining, what the Russians are going to be trying to explain to Li Qiang when they meet, when he meets Putin. I think the most important political discussions will happen when he meets Putin, by the way, which I believe will be tomorrow.
Okay. Well, then, what do you make of the Kaluba? You know, the Ukrainian foreign minister, it's not that long ago. He visited China, and everybody thought they are seriously considering to ask China to mediate something. But is that just a fake visit? You know, I mean, it's a real visit, but it's a fake effort. It seems like to trying to get some negotiation mediated by China. It's just a fake effort. Is that what it is?
This is what the Russians are saying. So the Russians are saying, that the Ukrainians were clearly planning this operation in Kursk all along. They're losing the war. I mean, they're continuing to lose the war. In fact, over the last 3 weeks, 2 weeks, things have actually got much worse for the Ukrainians because we'll no doubt come to that shortly. But they're losing the war. They know they're losing the war. They know they're going to lose the war. So what they're trying to do is prevent a total collapse, bring about a ceasefire, but avoid ultimately making any concessions at all, any of the substantive concessions that would be needed to achieve peace. They know that the international community, not just China, very, very much wants to see peace in Ukraine. And they know that China is a country in particular that likes to see peace, because peace is what everybody in the world should strive for.
Yeah.
So what the Ukrainians did is that they sent Kuleba to China. He met Wang Yi. He was apparently very, very vague about what Ukraine wanted to do, but he again talked peace and said Ukraine is willing to talk peace. And what the Ukrainians were really up to was that they were going to trying to catapult the Russians into talks at this time. And then the Ukrainians would then jump in, seize territory, perhaps the nuclear power station, and try to use that as a lever in negotiations. And what the Russians are now telling the Chinese is, don't trust the Ukrainians. We have been here many times ourselves before. You see, these people are impossible. You can't expect us to negotiate with them now. Eventually, we haven't ruled out negotiations. It's very interesting. Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, he's key foreign policy aide, actually said we have not completely ruled out negotiations. We've not taken anything off the table. What we're saying is that now is not the right time.
And the people who got into Kursk, they're the Chinese media is saying that they are not just Ukrainians. There are quite a few NATO people there, because there are people speaking English, French, and Polish, and even Georgian. So are they all mercenaries or or
This is exactly true. Now, I'm not going to try and get into percentages, but apparently large numbers of the Ukrainian troops who entered Kursk were basically mercenaries. Some of them are not mercenaries exactly. They are Western contractors who are undoubtedly there partly with the at the request of their government. So I mean, it's not unusual, as we know, for people to leave the military, join up various companies in the West, and in fact, these are just extensions of the Western military system. By the way, we shouldn't be. The Russians do exactly the same thing. I mean, that's what the Wagner organization is all about. Ultimately, it's controlled, as we saw last year, by the Russian authorities, despite the fact that it seemed at one point like it was going to break out of control. So, yes, they were there. I mean, the Americans, the British, the Poles, the Georgians, they were all there. And the Russians are citing that as proof, as not proof, but as evidence that the Kursk operation was not something that the Ukrainians did off their own bat, as their Western powers are pretending. They're saying that the Russians, all the major Western powers, were intimately involved in organizing and planning it. And I suspect they're right. At some level, they are.
What's their purpose? What is NATO doing this? I mean, are they really trying to get into a real war with Russia? Or, I mean, they must know that these things people will find out, right? Who these people are.
Yes.
And that will definitely anger the Russians, right? That the NATO, so many NATO people, mercenary or not, they are in there participating in this basically an invasion of Russia. They must know this angers Russia. What's their purpose?
This is an excellent question, because this is becoming so so obsessive now that it is way past the point of my ability to explain it rationally. I mean, the risks are so far out of proportion to any possible gains. I can only tell you what I think the Kursk operation was all about. This is my belief. But by the way, I started to express it. And then a few hours later, Russian officials started saying essentially the same thing. So I'm not saying they took their ideas from me. I'm sure they didn't. But what? Because I've followed the media, the Russian media, fairly closely. I get a sense of what's going on. I've looked at the geography of the Kursk region. Ukraine is losing the war in Donbass. This is now clear. It's been clear for many months. Over the last few weeks, things have got catastrophically worse. The Russian advances are accelerating, and the Russians are now close to capturing important places in Donbass, which would basically break the spine of the Ukrainian defense system there. We might be, some are saying we're perhaps 60 days from a position of collapse in Donbass. That's somebody else's estimate, by the way, it's not mine. But things are very, very bad. The West has massively invested in Ukraine. They cannot afford a geopolitical defeat, or so they think. I mean, they've worked themselves up into believing that. They can't afford also to lose face in front of Vladimir Putin, who they've made into, Lucifer's representative on Earth. I mean, so they can't face that. They're also, by the way, worried absurdly that the Chinese might, sort of rub its hands and say, well, they've lost in Donbass, so this is the moment to attack Taiwan. I mean, it's crazy, but I mean, there are people in the West who actually write and talk about these things, and I think it's representative of a certain strand of thought in the West. So they're going to lose in Ukraine. And they don't want this to happen, especially before the November elections in the United States. So they're looking around desperately for something that could change the course of the war. There's nothing they can do on the major battlefronts that are going to change the course of the war, because that's impossible now, and they know it. So one last tremendous, reckless throw of the dice send Ukrainian troops into Kursk region, make the 60-kilometer mile dash or whatever it is, try to seize the nuclear power station there, think that that's going to create a huge political earthquake in Moscow, create a crisis for Putin. The Russians would perhaps find it very difficult to launch an operation, military operation, to take the nuclear power station back under control. And that might then open a way, maybe for negotiations on completely different terms. And that might be a lot of what the Ukrainians were trying to do in the weeks that led up to this, all the talk of negotiations. And at the same time, maybe shake people's confidence inside Russia and Putin and his leadership, open him up to criticism, perhaps cause political instability in Russia as well. So I think that was what it was all about. Now, to me, it's so adventurous and so unbelievably reckless that I would say it's almost insane.
Yeah.
But it is consistent with the way in which Western governments have been acting for years now. Well, at least since last year, when the Ukrainian offensive in the summer failed.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think even Putin said that in his meeting. I think shortly after what happened, so he had a meeting, and in that meeting he said there are three things that they want to increase their negotiation bargainings chips, okay, and they want to open a new front so that they can, to divert some of the energy, but they divert Russian, but they divert themselves as well, right? So
yeah.
And then the third thing is what you're saying, trying to make divisions within Russian public, etc. Yeah. And I think also you're right. There's also involved in the U.S. Election as well, etc. But here's the thing: it's getting more and more dangerous, right?
Yes.
Because Russian is now very angry. First of all, I think it's because of the long stretch of their troops now. It's the supply has a problem. The Russian already cut their supply, and then in front of the troops, the Ukrainian troops, there was a minefield, so they cannot easily moving forward. But their behind were cut by Russia. So now they're backed. They're now backed in there. Well, so which means actually now Putin has extra bargaining chips now because he has people backed. So, I mean, have they thought about that? That's a possibility.
Well, they never think things through. Now, I've been speaking to a lot of military people. I should stress American military people, and they're all telling me exactly the same thing. Firstly, this is a massive diversion of resources. It's not diverting Russian resources from Donbass. It's diverting Ukrainian resources from Donbass. It's Ukraine that is overextended and overstretched, not Russia. So Ukraine ought to be holding back reserves and husbanding resources, not throwing them away on reckless gambles like this. So that's the first thing. The second thing they say, and this is, I'm talking about, I'll give some names. I mean, Jim Webb, who's a U.S. Marine officer, Daniel Davis, who's another person, other people like this, military people. There's a person who's been contacting me, very senior military person. I can't disclose his name because that's private. And they also, the other thing they say is the one place in Russia you don't want to invade is Kursk, because it is very, very unpopulated. So there's nothing really to hold on to there. It's basically tiny villages, lots of forests, rivers, little rivers, streams, very, very poor roads. Advancing into it is a logistical nightmare. It sets you up constantly for ambushes, which is, of course, exactly what's happening. So you're not going to be able to advance very far. You're very soon going to get entangled in the forests and the streams and the rivers and the minefields and all of that you're talking about. And you can only keep your troops supplied. This is not me, by the way. I mean, I'm not an expert in these things. This is what these people have said. You can only keep these troops supplied along basically two roads. The Russians have complete observation of those roads. And the Ukrainians are losing dozens of tanks and machines and all of these things, of which they are now desperately short already, trying to keep this grouping that they have supplied. And as you rightly say, exactly the way you said, the American expression is it's a fire bag. You get them in one place and then you can
Uh-huh.
sort of pound them.
Yeah.
So, and because it's so thinly populated, there's no place really where you can anchor your
Uh-huh.
troops down. So it's completely misguided. Now, today, I was just listening before we did this program to an American general called Bradley Gerritske, something like this.
Uh-huh.
And he gave an interview to military.com, which is one of the
Mm.
infinite number of American military journals. There's endless numbers of them. But he's a military man, very, very anti-China, by the way, very anti-Russia too. But he was saying exactly this. He said this is the stupidest military operation anybody has committed in a long time. He said it's as big a mistake as the American operation in Afghanistan was. He was putting it at that kind of level. He said even worse.
Mhm. Yeah, just so I just want to share with you, maybe you find that interesting. The Chinese media has a lot of discussions about this, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things they like to apply things is the art of war, the famous
Yeah.
book, The Art of War.
Mm.
So in the art of war, there's one famous thing called the 围魏救赵, which is exactly that, which is essentially when you have two sides, battling somewhere, and then you start in the third place, divert the resource, etc. That's the idea, but there is a real story behind it. So immediately when I saw this happen, I thought, oh, they have been, studying the art of war, but that doesn't sound right. The way they apply it is not right.
No.
Because in the art of war, the story behind this thing is there is a country during the warrior state period. So there was countries, fighting with each other all the time. So this country, Zhao, was attacked, surrounded by Wei. Okay, Wei, the country. And then Zhao was asking help from Qi, and Qi coming to Zhao's rescue by attacking Wei. All right, and so Wei have to pull back and to save them there. But here you see there's a third country involved. So the Qi actually very much worried about itself and they hated Wei. So that's why they have motivation to help Zhao. And the Qi is another country that wasn't have been into the war for 2 years and absolutely exhausted and all that kind of thing. And they're also very motivated. In this case, you're using your own troops. You divert your own resources to a place that is very hard to give supply. So it's just kind of interesting. That's how the Chinese media has been discussing this. And what I was thinking is maybe whoever giving advice to Zelensky, probably somebody from NATO, maybe instead of listening to that person, just to read the Chinese social media would be better.
I have no question. I'm going to make a general observation about Sun Tzu, the art of war, because, of course, it is constantly quoted in the West.
Yeah.
Whenever I do programs on military matters, I get all kinds of people, clever people, or people who think they're clever, quoting to me various things from Sun Tzu. You see, the trouble is Sun Tzu is a Chinese text.
Yeah.
And I think that Westerners simply don't get its subtlety and the way in which because I've read it, by the way, it blends politics, strategy, thinking. It's
Philosophy. It's also influenced some
philosophy.
philosophy. Yeah.
Exactly. I think that Westerners never really understand it because what they do is that they segment it. They fish out quotations from it. They take it one bit at a time rather than look at it all together. And I think the result is that they get this completely wrong. If you wanted to see a kind of strategy which Sun Tzu would say is absolutely wrong-headed and misguided, it would be the strategy the West is following. Not just in Ukraine, by the way, but pretty much everywhere else that they wage war. He'd say this is not the way to wage war. I'm sure he would strongly disapprove of the Kursk operation, which makes, as I said, no sort of military sense at all. By the way, for the record, the Russians are aware of Sun Tzu. but they've never really studied him. This is
Okay.
what I understand from Russians. They're still very tied up with Clausewitz and all of that. So I mean, they still thinking that. And Engels, by the way, Engels wrote a lot about war. So I mean, that is where their ideas of war come from. They've never really developed the thinking of Sun Tzu. And just as a point of history, it seems that this was a big issue in the 50s during the Korean War, when China and the Soviet Union were both supporting the DPRK, and the Russians very often just really didn't understand what the Chinese were saying. The Chinese, by the way, do know Clausewitz. Mao himself studied Clausewitz closely, but again, he took Clausewitz ideas, and he had this Chinese framework as well. And the Russians were much more rigid, and they didn't quite understand a lot of what the Chinese were saying. And I think this is still true, by the way. Just saying.
Yeah, the Sun Tzu is a fundamental idea, even though it's about art and war. He actually talked a lot about peace. You know
Yes. Yes.
how the real strengths lay on the peace, on the
Yes.
negotiation, on the avoid war. And if
Yes.
you have to resolve it by war is assistant for negotiation of peace. In the end, the achievement is always peace, should be. And if you have to be really prepared, well prepared for what you have to know what you're doing, right? And you have to have plan B, plan C, and all kinds of things,
Yes.
which I don't see that at all in the.
No. As I said, you're absolutely. I mean, there's certainly mine. I mean, again, I should say I read it years ago, and in English translation, which is always a dangerous thing to do, especially for such a sophisticated text.
Uh-huh.
But I don't think, as I said, that Westerners understand it very well. I mean, they're aware of it. They constantly cite it, but they always cite it to confirm their own ideas.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
use it in that kind of way. They don't. I think it's a big mistake, as I said, just to take a text and
Yeah.
fish out of it particular quotations
Yeah.
and tell yourself you're being very clever when you cite it like that. I think that's especially because I should say I read a lot of Chinese philosophy, again always in translation, but I think especially with Chinese philosophy it really doesn't make sense to do it that way. If you break it down and treat it like a kind of jigsaw, then you will lose the whole picture.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And now we're in the situation that also the Chinese media, I just saw yesterday, apparently Poland is moving some troops to the border. Belarus is doing that, and even North Korea has this pact they signed not long ago with Russia, pretty much agreed to militarily assist each other if anything happens. And now that Kursk happened, so North Korea think it's justifiable for them to fall in to help Russia, which has implication for China because North Korea actually China has an alliance, from the North Korea War. And so North Korea moved some troops to Russia. And if something happened from South Korea, actually China is obligated to protect North Korea. So you see everything is moving now to a dangerous direction. What do you make of that?
It is extremely dangerous, and it comes back to your previous question, which, by the way, I didn't properly answer, which is that what the West is doing is insanely reckless. I mean, the idea of sending Western troops into Russia, of having German tanks and armored vehicles operating inside Russia again. I mean, this is so wildly dangerous that, as I said, it's off the scale. And if the objective was to seize a nuclear power plant, that's a nuclear facility, even admittedly a civilian one. But I mean, that is incredibly dangerous. And as I pointed out in many programs, a fact that people have completely overlooked is that this nuclear power station is located close to a town called Kurchatov. Igor Kurchatov was a Russian scientist. The town is named after him. Was the Russian scientist who developed the Russian nuclear bomb, the Soviet nuclear bomb. He is the Soviet Oppenheimer. He was the man who was in charge of the Soviet Union's original nuclear weapons program. And if you know anything at all about the Soviet Union and the way that the topography is, you know, how if a town is created and named after him, that is almost definitely a sign that it's not just a nuclear power station that's located there, but also weapons facilities, design laboratories, institutions, probably very secret ones. And the Russians were always, the Soviets were very much into the business of creating sophisticated facilities. So threatening a place like this, even if most of the Soviet nuclear facilities have now been closed down, is wildly dangerous. It's completely, insanely reckless. And you see that the West, instead of pulling back and saying, well, let's talk seriously. Let's approach the Chinese. Let's say to the Russians through the Chinese, look, we understand your security concerns. We understand Ukraine can't join NATO. Let's see what agreements we can reach to stabilize the situation in Europe. They're now taking ever more reckless steps as the situation in Russia, Ukraine deteriorates. Now, ultimately, when one side behaves as recklessly as this, the other side inevitably is forced into a counter response. And that's why you're starting to see all these moves. The North Koreans doing their thing, sending people to Russia, the Belarusians moving troops to their border. I think that the mood in Moscow, President Putin's mood, those of the people around him, is such that they understand very well the dangers of this situation. They also know that they're winning the war. And I think that what they will be telling Kim Jong-un and Lukashenko and people like that is calm down. We have this situation under control. Thank you for your offers of help. We don't really need it. We don't need to do these things that you're telling us to do. It's not in our interests to escalate. It's not in your interests to escalate either. And I think that the Russians almost certainly are reassuring China that that is the stand that they are taking. And it's one reason, by the way, why the Chinese have shown such confidence in the Russian leadership up to this point. But, you know, that's I'm sure what's going on. But the willingness of the West to test this discipline and self-restraint that Moscow has is incredibly dangerous in itself. And there might eventually come that point when the Russians say, well, look, this has gone too far. We have to give a really strong response, because if we don't, then who knows what other crazy thing the Western powers might eventually do.
Yeah. I think, again, the Chinese social media, also some people are saying, which I agree, that now Kim Jong-un also has his own goal. He's young, he wants to unify the Korea Peninsula, and he's looking for opportunity. So if, something happens, and let's say that he send some troops to, maybe he just, even the rumor that he's sending troops to Ukraine, and then South Korea sees some opportunity to do something, maybe that's his excuse to do something. That could be one possibility. Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
I think that's a very real, very, very real possibility indeed. I think that the North Korean nuclear program, if I can say it straightforwardly, has now developed beyond the point when it can be seen purely as a shield against an American attack. And I think that the North Koreans absolutely do retain the objective of Korean unification under their leadership. The entire state is built around that objective. What has happened is that Kim Jong-un has leveraged the crisis in Ukraine with great skill. He's got the Russians basically to break the economic siege that the Americans had imposed on him. He's now going to get food and oil and all of these things from the Russians. It's going to make a significant material difference to North Korea. He's going to get a lot of technology. He's a clever man, but he's certainly one, I think, that needs to be watched very carefully. And I think that the Chinese will be telling the Russians this.
Yeah. I think, since it's already circulating in the Chinese social media, I'm sure the Chinese government is mindful of that. Yeah. What do you make of this Wall Street Journal article about Nordstream, that they have their explanation now for what happened? So lots of speculation in the Chinese social media. Is the West in the process of abandoning Zelensky, Zelensky? I mean, is that what the purpose of the article?
Well, the thing that struck me, both about the article and about the German indictment, the thing that struck me immediately was that the Germans have issued an indictment against somebody who they say is Vladimir Z. Now, why do they not give his name? I mean, there is no actual legal reason, by the way, why they would not name this person. Now, who else is Volodymyr Z? I mean, I accept this might just be coincidence or somebody slipped, but I don't believe that. I think that there is a faction in Germany and in the United States. I mean, we talked about the people who gamble, but there's the other side as well. We say, look, this has gone far enough. The Ukrainians are out of control. The whole situation is getting out of control. This is the time to bring it all to a stop. So we now identify the Ukrainians as being responsible for Nord Stream. Whether or not that was true, by the way, I don't know whether or not it was true, but we said it was the Ukrainians. We issued this indictment against Volodymyr Z, who probably is a real person. By the way, the Russians say that his real name is Zhuravlyov.
Okay.
Vladimir Zhuravlyov. But this is from the Russians. They're having lots of fun over Volodymyr Z, by the way. Again, there are people in the Pentagon, in the German military, who are looking at the military situation in Ukraine. They're saying the situation is completely out of control. Germany's having budget problems. The European economies are in a bad way. This is the time to call a stop. I think that there is that view, and I think this is what the Nord Stream revelations, if I can call them that, were all about.
Okay. And in the midst of all this, Putin just visited Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
What is that about?
Right. It's about getting Azerbaijan eventually to join the BRICS.
Okay.
Because it is a major oil and gas producer. It's a rich country in resource terms. It's by far the richest country in the Southern Caucasus. It's previously shown interest in aligning with the West, and the Russians absolutely do not want that to happen. It borders on Iran and, by the way, on Russia through the Caspian. It's a major Caspian sea power. And sure enough, directly after Putin returned to Moscow, Azerbaijan announced that it's now applying to join the BRICS. I think this is exactly what it was about. So
and then I want to ask you now, BRICS, they announced that they're going to temporarily suspend to take in new members.
Yes.
So my understanding, I think Lavrov is the one who announced this, and the purpose is they want to have some kind of a discussion internally in terms of how they want to run the organization before they take in the group, which makes sense to me. Is that your take on that?
I completely agree, and I think that's entirely right, by the way. By the way, before the big expansion that was announced in South Africa last year, I said at the time, I thought that expansion, the risk was that expansion was running out of control. There needed to be a clearer structure established first, because if you just had all all sorts of countries joining, however and in whatever the way they wanted, it risks degenerating into a talking shop. And I think this is what they're going to do. But notice that Azerbaijan is the first country of the first former Soviet republic, other than Russia itself, to make a formal application that I'm aware of to join the BRICS. And as I said, it's a major energy producer, and it's strategically an important country. And I am sure that the Russians want to propel it in that direction, though, of course, it will not join this year.
Yeah, yeah. I also think it makes sense that they
Mhm.
have some kind of a rule how to govern this, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, because in the beginning it wasn't much of a economic bloc. I mean, the
No.
concept of BRICS is coming from the West, right?
Yes.
From which bank was it that somebody
Yes,
was in?
it's American economist. I think he was at Goldman Sachs, wasn't he?
Yeah, Goldman
He came
Sachs,
up.
yes.
Goldman Sachs, yeah.
Yeah, and then the BRIC countries like, okay, maybe we can just talk a little bit. That was
Yeah.
how it started, right? It wasn't
Yes.
really purposefully to establish to do anything. So it's very loose. Yeah.
Absolutely. What changed it was when the United States started to change the rules of economic trade. When the moment that started to happen, the moment the United States started to impose sanctions on everybody and apply economic pressure on everybody, use the dollar in all kinds of ways, countries that want to trade with each other said, "Look, we've got to find alternatives," and there was the BRICS to hand, and they said, well, let's use this mechanism to do it, and that's how it's happened.
Yeah. And also the BRICS pay. I think Nabulina just maybe not that long ago announced that there are 159 countries are interested.
Yes.
But then again, I think it's the alternative to SWIFT. It's not purpose to replace the SWIFT,
No.
right? Because many countries, including China, Saudi and all the countries, they still have a lot of dollar-based assets. So they
Yes.
still need to trade through SWIFT. And so there is, but clearly there's interest. If there are that many, 159 countries interested, that's pretty significant, isn't it?
It is indeed. It is indeed. Now, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I would just point out, by the way, that there are many Russian banks that are still connected to SWIFT.
Oh,
It's
okay.
the state banks that are not, but you can still access SWIFT
Okay.
in Russia, and the Russians also will not want to completely replace SWIFT for that, at least for the moment, and for that reason. Again, these alternative systems, the alternative to SWIFTs that we're talking about, are only being created because of the way in which the West weaponized SWIFT.
Yeah.
It's not about SWIFT itself. SWIFT was seen as a good thing,
Yeah.
and there's no reason to dismantle something that is good and useful. The problem is that it's become dangerous to use. And the idea also, I suspect, is that if you can set up an alternative, it is less likely that the Americans will be able to weaponize SWIFT in the way that they have done before.
Yeah. The United States is so interesting because you hear politicians always talking about, okay, power comes with the responsibilities. They don't practice it, right?
No,
The SWIFT is a very powerful tool, but then when you use it, you cannot abuse it because when you
exactly.
abuse it, there will be consequences.
Yes.
They don't seem to understand that. They don't seem to care about that, it seems like.
Well, this is exactly correct. I mean, having the world's reserve currency, having a system like SWIFT, dominating the international financial system, obviously it gives you great economic advantages, but it is also a trust.
Yeah.
It's the world trusting you
Yeah.
to run the system in a certain way, and the Americans lost sight of that and have abused this trust, and with the results that we see.
Okay, Gaza situation.
Yeah.
There's some kind of a peace deal, but is it that a real ceasefire deal? It seems very odd because the Hamas wasn't even there during the negotiation.
Mm.
And then the odd thing to me is Blinken came out saying, oh, Netanyahu agreed to this and that. Why doesn't Netanyahu come out and saying we agree to this? It seems like, okay, if you're negotiating between A and B, and then C came said, okay, we have this peace deal that A agrees to. We're waiting for B. It's very odd to me. Is that a real ceasefire deal?
No, it's not. It's not a real ceasefire deal, and there cannot be a ceasefire in Gaza until the fundamental problem of an Israeli government led by Benjamin Netanyahu that does not want a ceasefire and that wants to prolong the conflict and perhaps expand it to Iran. Until that problem is solved, I don't think there can be a ceasefire. What happens is the moment we are close to getting an agreed ceasefire, Netanyahu comes along and says, look, this isn't good enough. I may have to agree to all of this before, but now I've got more conditions. And I'm not going to finalize my agreement until those conditions are satisfied. And he's going to go on doing this forever. In order to get a ceasefire, and Hamas have said this, and, you know, one might not like Hamas very much, but what they're saying here is absolutely correct. In order for there to be a ceasefire, the United States must do that which it has never done, which is tell the Israelis, look, enough's enough. This is the agreement. We need a ceasefire. These are the conditions. You must accept them. If you don't, we will come out publicly and blame you. And in fact, if necessary, take the matter back to the UN Security Council, which has called for a ceasefire, and see whether sanctions can be imposed under Chapter 7. Now, if you do that, you will get a ceasefire because Netanyahu can't say no. But the US has never shown any willingness to do that.
Now, this seems to me is an issue for the Democratic Party, isn't it? That if we are now talking to the US politics, so the past few days, as you know, the Democratic Party convention is now ongoing, and there is plenty of people outside the Chicago's convention protesting.
Yes.
It seems to me like this is particular an issue for the Democratic Party more so than the Republicans. The Republicans seems like we settled, we're going to support Israel no matter what. The Democrats are the ones who talking about ceasefire because they have large supporters are Muslims and Palestinians, etc. Or there are lots of people sympathize to the Palestinians, etc. So what they're doing seems to me like just like most things they do, they're not sincere. They want to have the surface, right? They want to give you the impression that they're doing something. There is a ceasefire, but it's not real because they have this problem. Is that what it is?
That's exactly what it is. I mean, the Democratic Party is a very weird construction because on the one hand, it sets itself up as the progressive side of the American political scene. As a result, it attracts the support of a lot of young people. It attracts people from many communities, Black people, Muslim people, people of that kind. At the same time, it is absolutely part of the American establishment. It is, in fact, the core of the American establishment. So, which is, of course, 100% squarely behind Israel. So they have to try and find some way of keeping their supporters happy, whilst at the same time, not really changing anything. So they go through the motions about getting ceasefires negotiated in Gaza. But of course, they don't really mean that. The only kind of ceasefire that the United States and Israel would unequivocally back was one which amounted to a complete capitulation by Hamas. And unless that happens, which it won't, what the Democrats will do, the Democratic administration will do, is that they will go through the motions of pretending that they're negotiating a ceasefire. And when a ceasefire fails to happen, they will blame Hamas. I mean, that's the approach they've taken. By the way, this has been true ever since I can remember, going all the way back to the late 1960s.
Yeah, that's why we never have peace, because
That's
there's
why we
never
never have peace.
there's never sincere effort from the United States.
No.
Yeah.
There have never been good faith negotiations to settle
Mhm.
the Arab-Israeli conflict. Never, not once. The Israelis have never really been interested in a just and lasting peace. Always they've pursued their maximalist objectives, which is total victory over the Arab populations in Palestine. And the Americans have never been sincere about their position as mediators. They set themselves up as mediators, but what they really drew is they tried to turn every negotiation into a capitulation to whatever demand the Israelis are making. I've lived through this for decades now. I've seen the same thing happen again and again and again.
What do you make of the Democratic Party convention? It's just a lot of a hoopla, going on. I haven't watched much of it. I can't stand it many
No,
times.
no.
But what is your impression of it?
It's the strangest election I have ever seen. I mean, I thought 2020 was pretty weird. I thought 2016 was pretty weird. But this one is absolutely bizarre. Firstly, we have a convention in which a small group of people have appointed the candidate. I mean, the convention itself. I mean, it's like a sort of caricature of what the American media pretends Congress is in China, and where actually real debate happens and people talk and discuss things. But if that isn't what's happened in the Democratic Party, everybody goes up, lifts their hands because a small group of people, like the old Soviet Politburo, have told them to. It's that kind of convention. The candidate that's been put forward has no plans, no policies, doesn't give interviews, doesn't make speeches, won't hold press conferences, won't engage in debates, won't appear on television. She's just sort of there. We have pictures everywhere of her. Again, it's the image rather than the reality of the person. They then produce a program for the election, a manifesto, if you like, for the election, which still continuously refers to Joe Biden as the candidate, not even Kamala Harris. I mean, completely bizarre.
Mhm.
And she then comes up with this very radical seeming proposal to, put controls to stop price gouging and things of that kind, which of course should not. I mean, I've read so many articles trying to take this thing seriously when there's no belief in it. I mean, it probably wouldn't work anyway, but put that aside. Does anybody really believe that Kamala Harris, if she was elected, would do any of these things?
No.
The idea is absurd.
Yeah. And you talk about this party platform is mentioning, that Joe Biden, which I also find very interesting. That the party, first of all, the party platform, they put it out before the convention.
Yeah.
Now it's no longer Biden's platform, right? It is the Kamala Harris administration's supposedly the platform, but in there they're still referring to the second term of Biden, which tells us, first of all, Kamala Harris hasn't read it. She cannot have
No,
read it.
no, of course not.
This is her platform, okay?
I know.
And she hasn't read it.
No.
Just tells you how much interest she has for running the country. I was thinking if I were put into her position, the first thing I would do, I'll look at the platform, right? I'll do some update. Maybe I'll just write the whole thing, rewrite the whole thing because this is now my platform.
Yeah.
She hasn't read it. She hasn't updated. The Democratic Party certainly doesn't interested in doing some update.
No.
What I mean, does that it just tells me that all these people are interested, for Kamala Harris in particular, all she's interested is be the president
Yes.
as the
Yes.
president, but she's not interested in working as a president to run the country, right?
No. No, absolutely. I mean, this is exactly where we are. I mean, this isn't about electing the president. It's about controlling the presidency and the office and
Okay.
the levers of power. I mean, the United States has gone from being even the kind of very flawed democracy that claim to
Mhm.
be, to become simply a situation where everything is controlled by a small group of insiders who who manipulate everybody else like puppets on a string. It's really actually, it's very sad, but if you look at it from a distance, it's also rather comical, actually,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
see this extraordinary divergence between the reality and the rhetoric.
Yeah. The fact that they don't even update their platform, I
No.
find that's extraordinary.
Well, it shows an
Um,
incredible disrespect towards the American people, if I can put it like that. I mean, at the very least.
yeah. And talking about, the people who are really in control in her team, the economic team, there are two guys, Brian Deese, and then there's other guy, Mike Pyle. See, we don't hear these names, but they are
No.
very, they clearly has been on in the Biden team for some time. And I suspect probably they were participating in some part of the Obama discussion as well. And they
Mm.
both come from BlackRock. Just
Yeah.
so, just so And talking about BlackRock, so I think the Russian media and also the Chinese media has been talking about BlackRock has bought or gets about 17 million hectares of Ukrainian agricultural
No.
land. Now Ukraine denying that. They did that through this thing called the Ukrainian Development Fund, right? What the Chinese media have been highlighting is that apparently the head of the BlackRock, Larry Fink, uh, even banned the bureau of military personnel. I mean, these are Ukrainian soldiers, and apparently Larry Fink, for those land that now belong to BlackRock, they don't want people to bury there. I mean, what does that say? Of course, there are people saying, no, 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 that's not true. But they saying this is Russian propaganda. I actually think if BlackRock owns those land, it's quite possible they would say you cannot use it. You know,
Absolutely, I think it's exactly true. I'm sure it is true. I mean, it's the empire dealing with the colony, and empires always, there's always people who come into the empires from the capital, the imperial capital, and plunder it. And that's what BlackRock is doing. And they have enormous influence in Washington. And as you can see, there's gathering around Kamala Harris now. By the way, it was exactly the same with Britain. I live in Britain.
Mhm.
If you go around Britain, around London, you see all the vast palatial residences. If you go around the English countryside, you see the vast palatial residences that people used to build. And it's a small country. England is very small. And you look at the size of these places, it's plunder from the West, from the colonies, rather. And if you go back even further to ancient Rome, they did it there too. Only they were even more open about it than the British.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's another thing I find interesting. They no longer hide. Lots of times,
No,
you can even read it. They kind of like pretty
yeah,
much admit it to.
no,
Yeah, they no longer covert, right? Yeah,
no,
that's yeah. Last thing I want to talk to you about color revolution. I think the Durham did a program about
yeah,
the Bangladesh
yeah,
situation. And we talked about this in the past. When it first happened, the Chinese media said that was because this their prime minister Zia, right, Khalida Zia, she was friendly to China, but also she's obviously very close to India.
yeah.
Well, I actually think it's a good thing for a country like Bangladesh, relatively speaking, small compared to China and India. So the fact that she has good relationship with both of them is a good thing. But apparently that somehow upset the US. So that's what this is. The US is targeting her because of her close relationship, in particular with India. Is that what it is?
Absolutely, but there's also another objective, which she's now actually disclosed, which is that the Americans are apparently putting enormous pressure on her to agree to the US establishing a big naval base in Bangladesh, so that the US could establish a permanent naval presence in the Bay of
Yeah.
Bengal. And
Mm-hmm.
she said no.
Mm-hmm.
And who is that naval presence directed against?
Yeah.
India, obviously,
Uh-huh.
and China to a certain extent. I
Yeah.
mean, no one else.
And if you were her, you will be under the pressure from both China and India to not to do it. And of course, you are located where you are. Of course, you wouldn't want to create tensions like that, right? That US base, once it's established there will be tensions with all these countries. It's never good for peace like that, right?
Well,
So,
Jeffrey Sachs once put it in a program we did with him on the Duran. Best of all, that if you want to make your country prosper, the way to do it is by being friends with the countries around you, and that's what I think she was trying to do in
yeah.
Bangladesh. Maybe not always very well. I mean, I'm not here to say that she was the best, excellent, wonderful prime minister. No doubt there were many things, but she got the strategic things right. There is no benefit to Bangladesh from having a naval base, a US naval base on its territory. There is lots of benefit from Bangladesh having peaceful and friendly relations with India and excellent relations with China. We discussed this in our last program. Bangladesh has been through a kind of economic boom. It's of a very, very limited level. The way to develop Bangladesh properly, economically, is to have the only country that can do it, China, come in, rebuild your infrastructure, build your railways, invest in your factories, help you to develop your economy in the way that you need it to be developed. In our last program, we talked about Vietnam, and we mentioned the fact that To Lam, the new Vietnamese president and general secretary, was going to China despite all the tensions that we talked about last time over Cambodia. He was there. They were talking about economic links. They were talking about the investment and industrial and infrastructure linkages. And you could see that Vietnam, despite whatever issues it might have with China, understands very well that ultimately, to benefit its own people, it needs to have good relations, the optimal relations with China, because it's from China that the investment and the technology and the infrastructure will come. In fact, I mean, if you look at the readouts of the various discussions between To Lam and Xi Jinping, you can see that, and that's the policy that Bangladesh ought to try to follow. And of course, that's not going to happen now.
yeah. And the color revolution is keep on going, right? It's not just limited to Bangladesh, because it's not.
No.
I think maybe 2 months ago, Pakistan had some internal. I would say they arrested many people, but we find out recently they let people know. But there was something going on there.
Oh yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, and then Cambodia also have something, to the degree that the Cambodia president, or prime minister, the leaders of Cambodia even warn people that there will be people coming out of in the name of demonstration, but they are doing something to trying to overthrow the government, something like that. It didn't happen because it seems like Cambodia got the news ahead of time and they were well prepared, so it didn't really happen. But Cambodia, leaders warned the public, and of course they did something. And it's not that long ago they did something in Serbia, etc.
Yeah. Well,
Venezuela is another place, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Russians back in, I think it was January, warned Bangladesh that this was coming there. Unfortunately, they didn't prepare for it well enough to deal with it. But you're absolutely right, and they're trying it in Thailand apparently, and they've been trying it in Myanmar. It's been an ongoing issue. So they do this all the time and in every place, even as the National Endowment for Democracy, the so-called NGO, it's not really an NGO, that is the primary mechanism for doing all of this. Apparently, it's in the grip of a massive internal feud. But nonetheless, in spite of all of that, they go on doing this thing wherever they can, and always, playing games of geopolitical chess, which when it's all over, we're going to see how completely irrelevant they are. I mean, if the Americans acquire their naval base in the Bay of Bengal, what ultimate difference is it going to make to the strategic balance of power? None.
Yeah, it would just irritates India and China and other than that.
Exactly.
Yeah. and then if you look at everything, it seems to me like the current administration does not interested in sincere effort to make peace in Middle East, in Ukraine, or even interested in running US, right? Because their platform just haven't been updated ever since Kamala Harris became the candidate. But one place they are sincere is doing all kinds of color revolution. That's where they seems do put in lots of effort in there.
Absolutely. This has become the big industry now. And you see a lot of people make a lot of money out of it. I mean, this is a very, very profitable operation, because color revolutions are very expensive things. You need to pour in huge amounts of money in order to make them work. I think I said in a previous program that the Russians disclosed how much money the US spent on one color revolution in Kyrgyzstan, which was $250 million. Now, this is an incredibly poor country, relatively small. I mean, there's no point in that. But if a color revolution in Kyrgyzstan costs that much money, that tells you how much money is involved in this game. And of course, a lot of people become very, very rich on the back of it.
Yeah, down to it, it's always somebody benefit from it. Yes, that's Okay, the last thing, there are two astronauts, U.S. astronaut, talking about the government is not governing, is now stuck in the International Space Center, right?
Yeah.
It's the latest one. Actually, Russian is the one who brought them some supply. Now, Russian brought it to its own astronauts, but also these two U.S. astronauts. There is very little coverage about that. That the fact the Russian was helping those two U.S. astronauts, right? Isn't it? That seems like these two are almost forgotten by the U.S. government.
They are effectively forgotten by the U.S. government. They're forgotten by everybody. You know, decades ago, back in the 1970s, I remember watching a science fiction film. This is during the era of détente, in which some American space people were marooned in space, just in Earth orbit. And they were eventually rescued by the Americans. But the interesting thing was that the Soviets also at that time, this is in the film, sent a spaceship to try and help these people. It wasn't necessary because the Americans in the film found the means to help. Well, here we have reality. It's now actually happening. The Russians come to help these people. And of course, nobody talks about the fact that these are people who are marooned in space. Nobody's talking about the fact that it's the Russians who are coming to their rescue. Nobody wants to talk about these things. If you were reading the British media over the last few weeks, you would think that the biggest event in the world that took place over the last couple of days is the fact that a big yacht capsized in a storm in the Mediterranean, and that a British billionaire was drowned. I mean, they're still writing about it now.
Okay. Yeah, it is interesting though, but but those already happened. The people died, or you know.
I know. What happens, as you said? I mean,
Yeah, and these two people are still alive and need to be rescued. Now, the whole thing, even before they came, they left the Earth. There were multiple issues. I thought they should just cancel the whole thing.
Yeah.
Why do they still taking the risk to send those people up there? I mean, why are they taking such a risk?
Again, there's a very simple answer to this. China again.
Okay.
Because the Americans are now becoming increasingly worried that the Chinese are establishing a major presence in space. The Americans are only fitfully interested in space. It's always about politics with them. So now China is big in space, so we must maintain our presence in space. So even if we take terrible risks and put people in dangerous situations, we must maintain the presence in space, because, well, we can't cede control of space to the Chinese, because that's the high ground, supposedly.
Yeah, and the result of that, those two people are stuck there, and they rely on the Russia supply to, you know, kept alive. So I find this disgrace that they're doing this, because these two are not really young. They're doing this to these people who are close to their, you know, retirement.
Absolutely.
I find this
Oh,
Incredible.
it is incredible, and one can imagine also the stress on these people and on their
Yes.
families, and I mean, it seems incredible that this should happen. But this is the US. I think, by the way, just to say, I think a lot of people in China don't understand the extent to which some people, not many people, but some powerful people in the US have China on the brain all the time, and the way it makes them do all kinds of strange things. I mean, the balloon incident. Remember that last year? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
that should have really perhaps shown this,
Hmm.
but they have China on the brain all the time,
Okay.
and it's one of the reasons why
Hmm.
they do these reckless things, why they've done this reckless thing in space.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, you're right. I think when I'm talking to regular people, people are not obsessed about
No,
China or Russia, or
no,
Iran,
no.
but somehow the powerful people in
Yeah,
Washington, some of them are totally obsessed with Russia,
no.
some of them totally obsessed with China,
Yes,
some of
yes,
them totally upset with Iran,
yes.
some of them obsessed with all of them.
Exactly, exactly. Exactly. And of course, they've now produced what we'll probably discuss next week, a new nuclear weapons defense thing in which we have to take them all on at the same time. The Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, the
And the
Iranians.
Iran. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
they're all they're all our adversaries. This is our nuclear program. Take them all on, everyone. I mean, it seems it is it is so frightening,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
stupid that one just doesn't know whether to tremble or to laugh.
it's a it's funny and dangerous at the same time, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
scary. Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, I'll look into that system that they're building. We can talk next time then.
yeah.
So, thank you so much.
It's their new nuclear weapons policy.
Okay,
Biden has just signed off on it. Apparently, that
so that's
China
what.
is n- China is now the major nuclear threat.
So
Apparently, overtaking Russia, but Russia is also very bad, and North Korea
okay,
is also. And they're all in a line against the United States together.
and that's the legacy that Biden want to leave. That
Well,
start a
absolutely.
nuclear war, kind of. Start.
Well,
Okay,
if not a nuclear war, then a nuclear arms race
okay,
against all of these countries at once. I mean, it seems amazing.
okay. Like we can continue next time, next Wednesday. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye.
You too.